In the winter of 1947, a county health inspector in rural Kentucky walked into a cabin that would haunt him until the day he died. What he found inside wasn't just poverty or neglect. It was something far more disturbing. 3 generations of a family living under one roof, but the family tree looked nothing like what nature intended. Brothers married to sisters, cousins bearing children with cousins, and at the center of it all, 2 sisters who had made an agreement that would create the most genetically damaged bloodline their county had ever documented. This wasn't folklore or legend. The inspector's report, buried in courthouse files for over 70 years, contained details so disturbing that local officials refused to make it public during their lifetimes. But death has a way of loosening tongues, and recently discovered documents reveal a story of genetic manipulation, family secrets, and children born into a nightmare they never chose. The Whitlock family name still exists in that Kentucky county, though most residents pretend it doesn't. Drive down the old mining roads, and you'll find abandoned homesteads where their descendants once lived. The locals won't talk about what happened there, but the courthouse records tell a different story. They tell us about Martha and Sarah Whitlock, 2 sisters who shared everything, including the man who would father children with both of them, creating a genetic catastrophe that medical professionals still study today as an example of what happens when bloodlines become too intertwined to sustain life itself. Martha and Sarah Whitlock were born into a life of extreme isolation in the heart of rural Kentucky. After their parents died in a mining accident when they were still children, the sisters were left to fend for themselves in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. They grew up in a remote cabin with only each other for company, their bond deepening into an almost unnatural codependence. Their relationship wasn't just that of siblings, it was one of survival, intertwined with a deep fear of abandonment. When Martha, at 19, announced her engagement to Thomas Hadley in the spring of 1923, it should have been a joyous occasion. For most it would have been the beginning of a new chapter, starting a family, building a future, but for Sarah, it was a nightmare. The thought of being left alone without her sister by her side pushed her to the edge. She threatened to kill herself if Martha went through with the marriage. In that moment, Martha made a promise that would alter the course of their lives and condemn generations of children to suffering. She promised Sarah that Thomas would be husband to both of them. At the time it seemed like a way to keep her sister from falling into despair, but little did they know that this agreement would set off a chain of events that would forever change their bloodline. Thomas, a distant cousin of both sisters, agreed to the arrangement, and in 1924, both Martha and Sarah were pregnant. The family would begin living together in a secluded cabin, far from the prying eyes of the outside world. They were no longer just a family, they were a closed unit, bound by an agreement that defied every social and biological norm their community held sacred. The first signs of trouble came sooner than anyone could have anticipated. By 1924, both Martha and Sarah were pregnant, and soon after, the births began. But what should have been a joyful occasion turned into something far darker. The children born from these unions began showing signs of genetic deformities almost immediately. The first child, James, a boy born to Martha, seemed perfectly healthy at first, but by the time he turned 12, the family knew something was terribly wrong. He developed severe seizures, and his spine began curving unnaturally. His growth was stunted so dramatically that by age 16, he looked like a 10-year-old child. The local doctors were baffled. No one could explain the sudden onset of such severe physical and neurological problems. Then came Mary, Sarah's firstborn. Her symptoms were even more disturbing. She was born with what doctors initially thought was a cleft palate, but further examination revealed that her entire facial structure was malformed. Her eyes were set too far apart, her skull was misshapen, and she was completely deaf. These were not isolated cases. As more children were born, more horrors emerged. Birth defects, developmental delays, and physical deformities became the norm. not the exception. But it wasn't just the physical ailments that were shocking, it was the fact that none of the children were ever given a chance to live normal lives. They were hidden away in the cabin, away from prying eyes, and their suffering was kept a secret from the outside world. Medical records from the county clinic, now long buried in public archives, provide disturbing insight into the family's predicament. What no one understood at the time was that Martha and Sarah had unknowingly started a catastrophic experiment in human genetics. Thomas Hadley, the man they had both married, wasn't just any man. He was their distant cousin, and his genes were already intertwined with theirs in ways that would prove disastrous. What started as a decision driven by fear and desperation was now a full-blown genetic nightmare, and yet the family remained in denial, unwilling to accept that their suffering was caused by the very choices they had made. By 1930, the situation had gone from bad to worse. The Hadley-Whitlock household had expanded with 8 children, 4 officially listed as Martha's and 4 as Sarah's, though Thomas Hadley was the father of all of them. The children grew up in a household that was by all outward appearances a polygamous unit, with the sisters as mothers and Thomas as their shared husband. To outsiders, it would have seemed strange, unsettling even, but it was far more than that. The family was creating a genetic disaster that was beginning to manifest in alarming ways. The first signs of this breakdown were subtle but unmistakable. The children, all of them, started exhibiting developmental delays that couldn't be explained by typical childhood illnesses. As they grew, it became clear that the family's shared bloodline was no longer capable of sustaining healthy offspring. The lack of genetic diversity was wreaking havoc on the children's bodies. James, who had already begun to show symptoms of severe neurological degeneration, was soon joined by others with similar afflictions. The second child, Mary, had multiple birth defects, but as time passed, more severe and complex disorders began to emerge. By the age of 12, she was suffering from a form of skeletal deformity that left her unable to walk without assistance. Doctors in the county were at a loss. They had never encountered a case like this before. The medical records now available to the public reveal the full extent of the genetic damage. One doctor noted that the children's condition was unlike anything we've ever seen in human beings, citing the highly unusual combination of defects, spina bifida, scoliosis, and a rare form of epilepsy that occurred exclusively in populations with extremely limited genetic diversity. It was clear the family was not only suffering from inbreeding, they were living the consequences of decades of genetic isolation. But the physical deformities were just the beginning. The psychological toll on the children was equally severe. Growing up in a household where 2 women were both mothers and sisters, and where the concept of family was blurred beyond recognition, left a lasting impact. The children began to develop emotional and psychological trauma, which would have been unrecognizable to most outsiders, and yet was an unfortunate side effect of their upbringing, and the damage continued to accumulate. By 1935, 6 of the 8 children were showing signs of severe genetic degradation. 2 died in infancy, their bodies unable to withstand the genetic incompatibility caused by the inbreeding. Yet, despite all the signs, the family remained in a state of denial. They continued their isolated existence, convinced that external forces were at fault, that bad luck or evil spirits were to blame for their suffering. As each new birth brought further deformities and complications, it became increasingly clear that this family, bound by secrecy, fear and ignorance, was descending into a genetic abyss. By 1940, the Hadley-Whitlock family had descended into complete chaos. The sisters, now in their 40s, still shared their home with Thomas and their growing children. The situation had already spiraled beyond repair, but what happened next seemed to defy reason. The eldest son, James, the one who had suffered the worst from the genetic disorders, had somehow fathered a child with his half-sister Mary, the girl born with severe facial malformations. This was not just a tragedy. It was the culmination of decades of genetic damage, now amplified by the incestuous relationships that were encouraged by Martha and Sarah. It seemed as though the family was locked in a pattern of self-destruction, one that couldn't be stopped, and the baby born from this union was nothing short of a medical horror. The child, who lived only 3 months, was born with malformed organs, no fully developed lungs, and a brain so severely damaged that it never achieved consciousness. Medical professionals who reviewed the case later described the baby as the most genetically compromised human being they had ever encountered. The child's body was a grotesque testament to the dangers of prolonged inbreeding, and its death was both a tragedy and a warning sign that things had gone too far. But even the death of the child didn't stop the family. Instead, it seemed to fuel the warped beliefs of Martha and Sarah. They refused to accept that their choices had led them to this point. They clung to their misguided conviction that keeping their bloodline pure would somehow solve the problems they had created. They began encouraging their surviving children to marry within the family, believing that over time they could eliminate the health issues that had plagued their family for so long. By 1942, there were 3 more children born within the family compound, each the result of unions between half-siblings or first cousins. These third-generation children were unlike anything that had ever been seen before in medical history. They carried the combined burden of generations of genetic degradation, and their bodies reflected this in ways that shocked even the most seasoned medical professionals. Club feet, skeletal deformities that left some children unable to walk, blindness and deafness were common among the third generation. Some children were so physically compromised that they could not even sit up on their own. But perhaps the most chilling case was that of a child born in 1943, whose organs were so malformed that doctors initially refused to believe the X-rays were from a living human being. His heart, liver and kidneys were all positioned incorrectly, and yet somehow he survived, if you could call it survival, for 2 agonizing years before succumbing to multiple organ failure. The doctors who tried to treat these children were confronted with a nightmare they had never experienced before, one that defied every medical understanding of genetics and human biology. The Hadley-Whitlock family had become an unprecedented case study in human genetic destruction, and the medical community was left to pick up the pieces of a bloodline that had been irreparably shattered. In the winter of 1947, a county health inspector named Robert Mills was sent to investigate reports of child neglect in a remote Kentucky mining community. The complaint had come from a local school teacher who noticed the absence of several children from her class, but what Mills found inside the Hadley-Whitlock cabin exceeded his worst nightmares. When Mills arrived, he was expecting to find a family living in squalor, perhaps struggling with poverty, but what he encountered was something far darker, a family locked in a genetic nightmare that no one outside their isolation had ever seen before. The cabin, a cramped, decaying structure, was home to 17 people, squeezed into just 4 rooms. There was no running water, no electricity, and minimal heat. Yet, the conditions of the house were not what disturbed Mills most. It was the children. Mills was faced with a scene so grotesque that it nearly overwhelmed him. The children, some of whom were young adults by now, were physically and mentally impaired in ways that Mills could scarcely comprehend. Some were unable to walk, others couldn't speak, and some couldn't even focus their eyes. Their physical deformities ranged from severely curved spines to clubbed feet and malformed limbs. But the most chilling aspect was that many of these children, who were technically half-siblings, had formed relationships with each other. The incestuous practices that had begun with Thomas, Martha, and Sarah had continued into the next generation. The family's psychological state was equally disturbing. Mills observed that they had created their own twisted worldview to justify their actions. Martha, now in her 60s and showing signs of severe mental decline, insisted that their suffering was part of a divine test. She told Mills that the family's problems were not caused by their own choices, but by external forces, evil spirits, contaminated water, or even government conspiracies. To her, their suffering had a higher purpose, one that outsiders could never understand. It became apparent that the family had lived in this bubble of delusion for decades, with Martha and Sarah actively encouraging their children to continue marrying within the family in an effort to purify the bloodline. Their twisted belief that the family's problems could be fixed through further inbreeding had led them to a breaking point, one that had now drawn the attention of the outside world. Mill's report, which would remain classified for decades, detailed the horrific scene inside the cabin, but it also contained something even more chilling. A family that was so deeply disconnected from reality that they had no understanding of the damage they had inflicted upon their own children. It was as if the very notion of what constituted normal human life had become a foreign concept to them. The next steps would prove to be just as harrowing. Mill's report triggered the intervention of state social services, but the road to rescuing the children would be far from simple. Robert Mill's report was a catalyst. What had begun as an investigation into child neglect would soon escalate into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Armed with Mill's documentation, state social services in Kentucky moved quickly to intervene. Their goal was clear: remove the children from the toxic environment that had been created by the Hadley-Whitlock family's decades of inbreeding and isolation. But when they arrived at the cabin in March 1947, they were unprepared for what they would find. The family had barricaded themselves inside the cabin, armed with shotguns, determined to keep their secluded world intact. Martha and Sarah, now in their 50s, were both deeply entrenched in their delusions. They believed that the government agents were part of a conspiracy to destroy what they saw as God's chosen people. The standoff lasted 3 days, with the authorities unable to enter without force. During those 3 days, 2 more children died, not from violence, but from the immense stress their severely compromised immune systems couldn't handle. The mental and physical toll of living in such a horrific environment had taken its toll on the children in ways that no one could have predicted. It was now clear that rescuing them from the family's grip would not be enough. Many of the children were so damaged by years of inbreeding that they could never live independently. When the standoff finally ended, and the children were removed from the cabin, the real work began. A team of medical specialists from the University of Kentucky was called in to evaluate the surviving children. What they found was a genetic disaster so profound that it defied belief. Of the 11 children still alive when state officials arrived, only 3 were deemed capable of potential rehabilitation. The rest suffered from a staggering combination of intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and medical conditions that required constant care. Several could neither speak nor walk. Some couldn't even perform basic human functions. One child, estimated to be around 12 years old, had the mental capacity of an infant and the physical development of a 6-year-old. For these children, the world outside the cabin was nothing more than a harsh, unforgiving reality they would never fully comprehend. Martha and Sarah were both committed to a state mental hospital, where they spent the remainder of their years. They never understood that their own choices had caused their children suffering. Instead, they clung to the belief that their family's genetic problems were the result of government interference, not the result of decades of isolation, incest, and denial. As for Thomas Hadley, the man whose decision to father children with 2 sisters set this entire chain of events in motion, he died in 1945 from liver failure. He never saw the full consequences of his actions, and he never understood the extent to which his choices had condemned his children and grandchildren to a life of suffering. His legacy lived on in the tragic aftermath of the family's collapse. The intervention by state officials in 1947 marked the end of the Hadley-Whitlock family's self-inflicted genetic experiment, but the scars, both physical and psychological, would never fade. What remained in the wake of their tragic existence was a legacy that would haunt not only the survivors, but everyone involved in their story. The children who survived the ordeal were left to face a world they had never known. For the 3 children deemed capable of rehabilitation, the road to recovery was long and painful. They were placed in foster care, given new identities. 6 Of the 11 children still alive when state officials arrived, only 3 were deemed capable of potential rehabilitation. The rest suffered from a staggering combination of intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and medical conditions that required constant care. Several could neither speak nor walk. Some couldn't even perform basic human functions. One child, estimated to be around 12 years old, had the mental capacity of an infant and the physical development of a 6-year-old. For these children, the world outside the cabin was nothing more than a harsh, unforgiving reality they would never fully comprehend. Martha and Sarah were both committed to a state mental hospital, where they spent the remainder of their years. They never understood that their own choices had caused their children suffering. Instead, they clung to the belief that their family's genetic problems were the result of government interference, not the result of decades of isolation, incest, and denial. As for Thomas Hadley, the man whose decision to father children with 2 sisters set this entire chain of events in motion, he died in 1945 from liver failure. He never saw the full consequences of his actions, and he never understood the extent to which his choices had condemned his children and grandchildren to a life of suffering. His legacy lived on in the tragic aftermath of the family's collapse. The intervention by state officials in 1947 marked the end of the Hadley-Whitlock family's self-inflicted genetic experiment. Perhaps the most chilling discovery, however, came from the family's own records. Hidden among Martha's belongings, investigators found detailed charts and notes that tracked the family's breeding practices, including which children should marry and which cousins should pair off to purify the bloodline. Martha, now in her 60s, had been planning genetic matches for children who weren't even born yet, extending her experiment into future generations. This plan, if left unchecked, could have resulted in even greater genetic catastrophe. As for Martha and Sarah, their lives ended in mental institutions, committed for their delusional beliefs. They never fully understood the extent of the damage they had caused, nor could they grasp the profound harm their choices had inflicted on their family. For them, the blame was always external: government interference, evil spirits, or divine punishment, but never their own actions. The cabin where the Hadley family once lived, now reclaimed by the Kentucky wilderness, remains a grim reminder of their legacy. The foundation stones are still visible through the overgrown underbrush, and locals occasionally report finding old bottles and rusted farming tools in the woods surrounding the property. But no one dares to build there, no one camps there, and no one speaks of what happened on that isolated hillside. The story of the Hadley family, however, lives on, not just in the medical records and academic studies that followed, but in the minds of those who were touched by their tragic existence. Some secrets, no matter how dark, refuse to be forgotten. The Hadley family's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that when fear, ignorance, and love become twisted by desperation, the results can be more destructive than anyone could ever have imagined. The Hadley family's story didn't end with the intervention of state authorities in 1947. It lived on in the haunting legacy they left behind, a legacy that continued to ripple through the lives of those who were involved and the medical community that studied their case. Even decades later, the story of their genetic destruction serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of isolation, fear, and ignorance. Today, the cabin where the family once lived has been reclaimed by the Kentucky wilderness. The foundation stones are still visible through the thick undergrowth, a silent testament to the lives that were lived and lost within those 4 walls. Locals rarely speak of the Hadley family, and if they do, it's often in hushed tones, whispers of a dark history that has cast a shadow over the community for generations. Despite the silence, the story of the Hadley family lives on, not just in the forgotten corners of rural Kentucky, but in the scientific records and academic journals where their case is studied as a cautionary tale. Their story has become a permanent fixture in the annals of medical history, cited by geneticists and doctors as an example of the catastrophic consequences of unchecked inbreeding and genetic isolation. It serves as a lesson that, no matter how isolated a family may be, the consequences of their actions can reach far beyond their own lives. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this legacy is the understanding that it all began with a promise between two sisters, Martha and Sarah Whitlock, who were driven by fear and loneliness, desperate to preserve the only family they had left. Their decision to share a husband and encourage inbreeding was rooted in love, but a twisted, misguided love that led to a fate more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The Hadley family's tragic downfall offers a sobering glimpse into the darkest corners of human nature, where desperation and fear can warp the bonds of family and create a legacy of suffering that echoes through generations. It reminds us of the importance of understanding the consequences of our actions, the dangers of isolation, and the perils of refusing to confront the truth. As you think about the Hadley family and the decisions that led to their ruin, remember this: sometimes the most destructive forces come from within, and the damage caused by ignorance and fear can last for generations. Some secrets, no matter how dark, are never fully forgotten, and the Hadley family's story is one that will never be erased from the history books.